So in order to first start my project, I first started looking at Joseph Pelling and Becky Sloan's Don't Hug Me I'm Scared, which is an internet video. So I first started looking at the main antagonist, I guess you would say, whose name is Sketchbook, and they are literally just a sketchbook that's been personified. So as you can see, I've made notes around each of my sketches. So I wanted to make a note on the texture, as a lot of the puppets had the appearance that they'd quite obviously been sewn. So for example, with this sketch, it had quite obviously been sewn onto the front of Sketchbook's face, because you could see the individual stitches where the font had been stitched on, as well as the fact that you could quite easily see that the solid shapes were fabric. So when it first came to drawing these, I first started by drawing the basic outline, which was admittedly quite easily done. But I feel that the simplicity of Joseph Pelling and Becky Sloan's characters is what makes it appropriate for a kids show, because you tend to see that a lot of children's shows do not have characters that are complex to draw. So for example, The Simpsons, that's quite simplistic. So I feel that I had to experiment with the simplistic forms that Becky Sloan and Joseph Pelling used within their work, because I needed to get into the mindset of being able to make a children's show. And as I've researched on, as it shows in my sketchbook, that it shows that a lot of children's shows incorporate forms that are quite simplistic, because as children's minds are developing, they learn to associate with shapes, with colour, especially when they're learning how to read. I also felt that in order to get the initial quite innocent appearance of the characters, I needed to experiment with the drawing style, which then later led me to discover that it's actually quite unsettling with how white and wide the eyes are. I also made notes into how the character moved. So for example, there is a note about how the bottom lip would just move up and down to mimic the action of talking, as well as the fact that Sketchbook's arm would also move up and down. So I felt that that was necessary to make a note upon, as I would perhaps have to experiment with different movements. I also specifically focused on some of the felt designs that had been sewn onto Sketchbook's face as the show progressed. So for example, this heart one, I just felt that I needed to experiment with it, because it's not often a thing that we see within innocent children's shows. We don't normally see a heart that's scientifically accurate. Normally we see a heart that is very basically shaped. So I feel that this definitely foreshadows the gory events that occur later on in the show. Same with this one as well. You don't exactly see a brain within a lot of children's shows unless it's more violent ones like Looney Tunes and The Simpsons with the itchy and scratchy cartoons. So next I felt it was necessary to also draw and analyse one of my personally favourite characters from Don't Hug Me I'm Scared. His name has been dubbed Yellow Guy because none of them have any actual names. I also feel that the fact that the simplistic names of the characters, because he is literally yellow in colour and he is a boy, it just shows how simplistic children's shows are and how they can be deemed as innocent because of the simplicity behind the way that they're presented, when in fact some of them actually aren't, because of how influential they are on developing minds. So I made note on how vivid the colours were, as well as the character's voice, which again was something that I would have had to consider if I would have made my show. So as you can see, I've also incorporated blue and yellow as they are his main colours, as I felt that it just added a lot of texture to the page, but also illustrated my point of the vivid colours within the colour palette. And in all honesty, the colour scheme behind Yellow Guy, the blue and the yellow, as well as Red Guy, they definitely inspired me later on in my work to continue using primary colours. This is because I just love the way that primary colours look, especially when together, because they're all so bold and they just all contrast with one another and bring each other out. And it also relates to the whole fact that I was focusing on doing a children's show, and primary colours are often associated with children because of the bright, vivid nature behind the colours. Now, when I was drawing Red Guy, I did particularly find it quite challenging because initially it is very simple, as it is wavy lines to represent the string that he is made of with two sewn eyes on top. However, I actually did end up really liking these drawings that I did because they are quite unsettling, because it's obvious that there is a person under there, but the whole appearance of the head and the bodysuit covering the person underneath creates quite an unsettling atmosphere. This then relates to the John Yui inspired work that I did, where I created stickers. This relates because I did research upon how masks distort the human form, and this is why we find them so unsettling and so creepy, because we know that there is a person underneath, but their form is distorted and a part of who they are is hidden. And as humans, we don't like the unknown. We tend to need that control and that order in our lives, otherwise we just feel unsettled. I also made notes upon how he has quite a blatantly monotone voice and that he's well spoken, which I would say is not specifically used in a lot of children's shows, because in a lot of children's shows they have silly voices like Yellow Guy does, or perhaps they just don't really speak that much. So for example, Itchy and Scratchy from The Simpsons, Roadrunner from Looney Tunes, they just make certain noises. Whereas Red Guy, he is very monotone, which I feel further intensifies the creepy atmosphere that the show has all around, because a lot of children's shows, they incorporate silly voices or odd noises that children will find entertaining because it provides them with escapism. So using a human voice, it's just really odd, so I felt that I needed to make a note upon that, and that I could perhaps have experimented with it later on if I had continued to make my show. I also found it quite interesting that the character was continually unfriendly as the show progressed, which is just quite odd in terms of being incorporated into a children's show, as most characters are very happy, wide-eyed, brightly coloured, and a lot of the time they might address the camera and ask questions and have an enthusiastic voice, for example like Dora the Explorer. But he is the exact opposite. So I thought that this definitely foreshadowed the disturbing events that later occur in Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. So it's definitely something that I could have perhaps experimented with if I'd have continued to make my children's show. However, my process later changed, and I'll reveal to you why as the sketchbook progresses. So the final character that I researched into from Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is called Duck Guy, which further intensifies the initial innocence and initial simplicity behind the show, but then obviously the characters are definitely much more complex than that because of the disturbing events that they go through. Admittedly, I did find this one quite challenging, as there are so many different textures. So for example, there is the fur that Duck Guy is basically made out of, But then this is contrasted with the simplistic shapes of his jacket and his beak and his eyes. Admittedly, I did find this sketch quite difficult, even though it does appear quite childlike. It was very strange to draw such simplistic shapes when I had just drawn something that was quite detailed. But I felt that I needed to take a step backwards and draw more simplistic forms, because those are the ones that are often used in children's shows, and it just made more sense for me to look at simplistic forms and how forms, when structured, they can make a character which is then used in a children's show. So this particular drawing has stitches incorporated into it, as the piece itself was made of felt and you could see the running stitch that ran around the piece, which I found was really interesting because it relates a lot to my later processes where I was experimenting with Grayson Perry's process of sewing, as he often incorporates textiles within his work, and so I felt that it was necessary to first experiment with the aesthetic of sewing and then slowly progress onto actually sewing something. So with this sketch, I actually really enjoyed this because it reminded me a lot of my previous project in A-level, where I did a project that was continuously about hands. So this was quite nostalgic for me because I hadn't drawn a lot of hands since then. I also particularly love the variation of texture because you have Duck Guy's plaid jacket, which is made out of felt, and then you have his fur skin, which is a bottle green, and then you have the flesh in his fingers, which is red and yellow. Again, the appearance of flesh is not necessarily something you would see in a children's show, so I felt that it was necessary for me to draw disturbing events because they're not often represented in a lot of children's shows. However, they obviously are represented in ones for slightly older audiences, so for example with Itch and Scratchy from The Simpsons and Looney Tunes in general, mainly Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. However, I really wasn't focusing on the fact that children's shows show violent events, and I was more focused on the way that the violent events had been presented aesthetically, as I just wanted to see how flesh and organs were represented in a cartoon style so that I could basically get the basic shapes of the organs and of the flesh, as if I would have originally tried to sketch a heart or sketch some flesh, I would have tried to draw it realistically because it was quite difficult for me to visualise the basic shapes within a more detailed three-dimensional thing. So I felt that I had to, again, take a step backwards and look at the way that cartoons represent violence and the way that they use simplistic shapes to overall show disturbing events.